Imagine being 19, forced to marry a man twice your size who society swears won't survive a year, then discovering he chose you on purpose, and the reason will shatter your heart. My beautiful family, before we step into this chapel together, quick pause. My granny keeps nagging me that if we hit 1,000 subscribers, she'll finally stop hiding my biscuits and share them with the whole village. Help me prove her wrong. Hit that subscribe button right now so we can grow this little story circle. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? London? New York? A cozy cottage in the countryside? Like this video too. It helps YouTube share these stories with more hearts that need them. Now, let's watch Lynette walk down that aisle. The chapel candles flickered against ancient stone walls, their wavering light catching on the gold embroidery of the altar cloth as hushed whispers snaked through the pews of St. Cuthbert's. Lynette Penrose stood frozen before the priest, her prayer book pressed so tightly against her rib cage she could barely breathe. At 19, with her heart-shaped face pale as parchment beneath the heavy honeyed-in lace veil, she had become the subject of London's most pitying gossip. Poor creature, Lady Ashford murmured behind her painted fan 3 rows back. Sold like livestock to settle a gambling debt. To the Duke of Hathersage, no less, another voice added with barely disguised satisfaction. They say his physician gives him 6 months at most. That massive frame cannot sustain itself much longer. Heat flooded Lynette's cheeks, but she kept her spine straight as her governess had drilled into her through years of deportment lessons. Her gloved fingers trembled against the prayer book's leather binding. Beside her, the Duke shifted his considerable weight, and she felt rather than saw him lean more heavily upon his gold-pummeled cane. The priest's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Do you, Lynette Genevieve Penrose, take this man?" She forced herself to glance sideways. Barnaby Cruikshank, Duke of Hathersage, towered above her like an oak tree beside a sapling. His cream brocade waistcoat strained across his barrel chest, and his dark hair swept back from a face that would have been handsome, was handsome, still, if not for the pallor of chronic exhaustion and the tightness around his mouth that spoke of constant pain. Yet when his eyes met hers, they held an unexpected gentleness. "I will," she whispered, her voice lost beneath the whispers that refused to die. "And do you, Barnaby Augustus Cruikshank?" "I do." His voice cut through the chapel with surprising strength. Rich as aged brandy, steady despite the visible effort it took him to stand unaided for even this brief ceremony. The congregation fell silent. Somewhere in the back pews, Lady Dorothea Grimshaw, Lynette's guardian and architect of this marriage, smiled like a cat who'd secured the cream and the canary both. The priest pronounced them man and wife. The Duke turned to his bride with careful deliberation, each movement calculated. When he lifted her veil, his large hand was remarkably gentle. Their lips met for the briefest moment, his breath warm against her frozen face. And then it was done. As they turned to face the assembly, Barnaby's hand settled on Lynette's arm, not gripping, not claiming, but steadying. Protective, almost. The paradox confused her. Here was a man society deemed too weak to live out the year, yet his touch made her feel safer than she had since her father died. The chapel bells began their clamorous celebration. Wedding guests rose in a rustle of silk and speculation, and Lynette felt the Duke lean more heavily on his cane as they began the long walk down the aisle. Each step seemed to cost him, his breathing audible in the spaces between bell chimes. He'll collapse before they reached the vestibule. Someone predicted, the wedding breakfast shall be his funeral dinner. But Barnaby Cruikshank continued forward, his jaw set with the determination of a man who had survived far worse than society's judgment. And on his arm, clutching her bouquet of white roses like a talisman, Lynette walked toward a future she could not possibly imagine, one that would begin with confession in the darkness and end with a miracle beneath the mistletoe. But as the wedding breakfast begins in the grand hall of Hathersage Manor, with Lady Dorothea presiding like a victorious general and cruel whispers swirling through the toasts, no one, not even terrified little Lynette, could imagine what the Duke will confess when the bedroom door finally closes tonight, or how those words will transform them both forever. The wedding breakfast had been an exercise in controlled torture. For 3 hours, Lynette sat rigid at the head table while Lady Dorothea held court, accepting congratulations as though she herself had wed a duke. The guests consumed roasted pheasant and syllabub while trading speculation about how many weeks the groom might last. Barnaby bore it all with stoic silence, touching nothing on his plate despite the whispers that labeled him a glutton. When the final toast concluded, he rose with visible effort and extended his hand. "Come, my dear. You look exhausted." Lynette accepted gratefully, her legs unsteady as he guided her through the gauntlet of knowing smiles and pitying glances. His grip on her elbow remained steady even as he leaned heavily on his cane, navigating the marble corridors of Hathersidge Manor with the careful precision of someone intimately familiar with his body's limitations. He led her not to the expected bridal chamber, but to a smaller sitting room where a fire crackled cheerfully in the grate. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly the noise and cruelty fell away, leaving only silence and the pop of burning logs. "Please sit." Barnaby gestured to a velvet chair before lowering himself onto a reinforced settee with an audible exhale of relief. He set his cane aside and studied her with those penetrating eyes. "I imagine you have questions." Lynette's throat felt dry. "Your Grace, Barnaby," he interrupted gently. "We are married now, Lynette. I should very much like to hear my name from your lips, at least in private." She clasped her trembling hands in her lap. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" "Lady Dorothea said you needed that the debts—" "Your father's gambling debts were considerable." "Yes, but that is not why I chose you." He leaned forward, his expression grave. 3 months ago, I sat beside your father's deathbed. We had served together in the peninsula. You see, he was delirious with fever, calling for you, terrified of what would become of you in Dorothea's clutches. Lynette's breath caught. "You knew my father?" "Captain Edward Penrose saved my life at Badajoz. Took a musket-ball meant for me." Barnaby's voice roughened. "I promised him, swore on my honor, that I would protect his daughter. When I made inquiries, I discovered Dorothea had already begun entertaining offers." The gentleman in question, his jaw tightened. "Let us say they had reputations that would have made your life unspeakable." Hot tears pricked Lynette's eyes. "You married me out of duty." "I married you to keep a promise to a man who deserved better than the death he got, and to spare you from monsters who would have broken you." He met her gaze steadily. "You need not fear me, Lynette. This marriage will be whatever you wish it to be. You have my protection, my name, and my respect. Nothing more will ever be required of you." The kindness in his words shattered something inside her, but before she could respond, Barnaby shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to his side, and she saw a genuine pain flash across his features. "Your health," she whispered. They say I am a glutton who has eaten himself to death." Bitterness crept into his voice. "But when I explain the true cause of my condition, you won't believe what society has blamed me for all these years." Barnaby rose with effort and moved to the sideboard, pouring himself a measure of brandy with hands that trembled slightly. The firelight cast shadows across his broad frame, and Lynette noticed how carefully he distributed his weight, as though standing itself required strategic planning. "Badajoz, 1812, he began, his back still turned. A French saber caught me here." He touched his lower back. "The field surgeon said I was fortunate. It missed my spine by inches. I spent 6 months learning to walk again." He took a slow sip before facing her. But the real curse began afterward. Lynette leaned forward, her fear gradually giving way to curiosity. "Within a year, I began to change. My joints swelled. My body retained water no matter what I ate or drank. I grew exhausted walking from room to room, yet couldn't sleep through the night." His voice carried the weariness of years spent explaining the inexplicable. "The weight came despite eating less than my stable boys. My face flushed at the slightest exertion. My heart raced climbing a single flight of stairs. But surely, physicians, 17 physicians, Lynette, from London's finest to a charlatan in Bath who prescribed leeches and prayer. Bitterness edged his words. Everyone concluded the same. I was a weak-willed aristocrat who couldn't push away from the dinner table. They blamed gluttony, sloth, moral failing. One suggested I simply lacked the character to control my appetites. Lynette's hands clenched in her lap. The cruelty of it struck her like a physical blow. I kept records, Barnaby continued, returning to his seat with visible relief. Everything I consumed, every symptom, every treatment attempted. I documented it all because I knew something was deeply wrong beyond mere excess. But when physicians saw my size, they stopped listening. Society saw my cane and assumed I brought upon myself. That's monstrous, Lynette whispered. That's London. He met her eyes with a sardonic smile. So I retreated here to Hathersage, stopped attending social functions where I'd become a cautionary tale. The whispers followed anyway. The gluttonous Duke won't last another season. I became a ghost story mothers told daughters about the wages of sin. Something fierce awakened in Lynette's chest. This man, this honorable man who'd married her out of loyalty to her dead father, had been fighting an invisible war while society mocked him as a glutton. Where are these records now? She asked quietly. Barnaby looked surprised by the question. In my study, years of useless documentation. I've rather given up finding answers. May I see them? He studied her with those sharp eyes, and something shifted in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or simply bewilderment that anyone would care. If you wish, though I warn you, they make for grim reading. Lynette stood, her wedding dress rustling. I should like to see them. Tomorrow, if you'll permit it. You need not trouble yourself. You troubled yourself to save me from Lady Dorothea's schemes, she interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. The least I can do is trouble myself to understand. For the first time since their wedding, Barnaby smiled, a real smile that reached his tired eyes. Then tomorrow, Duchess, I shall show you my collection of failures. But neither of them knew that hidden within those meticulous records lay the key to everything. Proof that the Duke of Hathersage had been fighting this battle alone for far too long. Proof that Lynette Penrose was about to discover. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Barnaby's study as Lynette traced her fingers along the leather spines lining the shelves. He had excused himself for a brief meeting with a steward, leaving her alone with years of accumulated defeat. The ledgers occupied an entire shelf. 14 volumes bound in identical dark blue morocco, each spine labeled with meticulous dates. She pulled down the earliest, January 1813 to December 1813. The first entry stopped her breath. January 10th, weight 13 stone, 2 pounds. Consumed, 1 bowl porridge, weak tea, plain chicken breast, boiled vegetables. Symptoms: severe joint pain both knees, swelling in hands, exhaustion upon waking despite 9 hours sleep, pulse racing, counted 98 beats per minute at rest. Page after page revealed the same heartbreaking pattern. Barnaby had documented everything with scientific precision, meals that would barely sustain a growing boy. Yet his weight climbed relentlessly, symptoms that worsened regardless of the punishing regimens physicians prescribed. Dr. Forthwick's recommendation: reduce food intake by half. Increase walking to 3 miles daily. Result after 6 weeks. Weight increased 8 pounds. Collapsed on stairs. Cannot walk prescribed distance. Lynette sank into his chair, pulling ledger after ledger into her lap. The tragedy unfolded in his careful hand. Mercury treatments that poisoned him, bloodletting that left him too weak to stand, starvation diets that somehow accelerated his decline. And through it all, the physician's consistent verdict: patient lacks discipline. Her hand shook with fury as she read a London specialist assessment from 1818. The Duke's condition stems entirely from moral weakness and excessive indulgence. Until he develops the character to control his base appetites, no treatment will succeed. Fools, she whispered fiercely. Blind, Arrogant fools. But buried in the later volumes, she found something else. Barnaby had begun collecting medical texts, annotating them with desperate notes. A treatise on glandular disorders lay open to a marked passage about the adrenal system. Another text on battlefield injuries and their long-term effects bore marginalia in his hand. Why does injury to the lower spine correlate with subsequent weight gain in some soldiers but not others? He'd been searching for answers himself, teaching himself anatomy and physiology, while society dismissed him as a glutton. Lynette stood abruptly, her wetting nerves replaced by something fiercer. This man had saved her from monsters. The least she could do was refuse to let him give up. She gathered the most recent ledgers and several of the medical texts, carrying them to the morning room, where better light flooded through the windows. For the next 4 hours, she read with intense focus, making notes of her own. Patterns emerged that the physicians had missed. Symptoms that preceded weight gain, the peculiar distribution of swelling, the way his condition worsened under stress. By afternoon, she filled 3 pages with observations and questions. The medical library at her father's house had been small but respectable. She remembered reading about glandular systems, about how the body's mysterious chemistry could betray even the most disciplined individual. There had to be someone, somewhere, who would look beyond Barnaby's size and see the real illness beneath. Armed with his data, Lynette began a desperate search through his collection of medical journals and correspondence. And buried in a pile of rejected consultation requests, she found a letter from an unconventional Scottish physician named Dr. Malcolm Fletcher. One doctor, it seemed, willing to challenge every expert in London. Dr. Malcolm Fletcher's letter had been buried beneath a stack of dismissive responses from London's medical establishment. Unlike the others, his reply carried no condescension, only keen interest in Barnaby's meticulously documented symptoms. Lynette wrote to him that very afternoon, including copies of the most recent ledger entries and her own observations. His response arrived with startling speed, the Edinburgh postmark dated barely 4 days later. Dear Duchess, it began in a bold, slanting hand. Your husband's presentation strongly suggests adrenal insufficiency secondary to spinal trauma. The glands above the kidneys, when damaged or suppressed, produce precisely the cascade of symptoms documented: sodium retention, potassium depletion, abnormal fat distribution, muscle weakness, exhaustion. That 17 physicians failed to consider this speaks more to medical dogma than diagnostic acumen. Lynette's heart hammered as she read a proposed treatment. Carefully calibrated extract from animal adrenal glands, combined with a mineral-rich diet emphasizing salt, potassium, and specific nutrients. It was radical and proven. The medical establishment would call it quackery. She found Barnaby in the library, staring out the window with the defeated posture of a man who'd stopped hoping. I've received a response from Dr. Fletcher. She kept her voice steady. He turned slowly. Another theory about my weak character, I presume? He believes your adrenal glands are failing, that the battlefield injury damaged something the other physicians never thought to examine. She crossed him, pressing Fletcher's letter into his hands. He wants to try glandular therapy. Barnaby read in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he set the letter down with careful precision. Lynette, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but no. The word emerged more forcefully than she'd intended. No, you will not give up. Not when there's finally someone willing to look beyond what society says you are and see what's actually wrong. This could be another failure. Then it will be another failure we face together. She grasped his large hands in her small ones. You saved me, Barnaby. You married me to keep a promise to a dying man and spare me from cruelty. Let me do this. Let me try. Something shifted in his tired eyes, uncertainty warring with a spark of hope he'd long since buried. You truly believe this could work? I believe you deserve a physician who treats you as a patient worthy of real investigation, not moral judgment. Her grip tightened. Please, let me help you. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the clock's measured ticking. Finally, Barnaby exhaled slowly and nodded. "Very well, Duchess. Write to your Scottish physician. If you're already rooting for a tiny Lynette to save her gentle giant Duke, and you haven't subscribed yet, imagine missing the moment he takes his first pain-free steps. Don't risk it. Subscribe now, so the algorithm never hides a rest from you. And if you truly won't subscribe, come confess in the comments why you want to break my granny's heart." Dr. Fletcher's treatment plan arrived within the week, along with the first shipment of carefully prepared glandular extracts and detailed dietary instructions. Lynette studied the pages with growing determination, then growing dread as she realized what implementation would require. Every meal would need complete reformation, precise measurements, specific preparations. The kitchen staff had operated without meaningful oversight for years under a Duke too exhausted to care what appeared on his plate. Barnaby noticed her expression. "What troubles you?" "Your cook," Lynette said quietly. "Mrs. Blackwood has run these kitchens for 20 years. She will not take kindly to a 19-year-old Duchess dictating menus. She'll follow orders. She's a servant." But Lynette had glimpsed Mrs. Blackwood at the wedding breakfast, a formidable woman who ruled her domain like a general, who'd likely view Fletcher's requirements as a personal insult to her culinary expertise. Implementing the treatment meant declaring war on the entire household staff, and it would start with the tyrannical cook. Mrs. Blackwood stood before the kitchen hearth like a fortress wall, her arms crossed over her formidable bosom, her face the color of raw beef. Behind her, 3 kitchen maids and the scullery boy watched with barely concealed anticipation. Boiled chicken, plain vegetables, no cream sauces. The cook's voice dripped contempt. "Your Grace would reduce His Grace's table to invalid fare." Lynette clutched Dr. Fletcher's instructions, willing her voice not to shake. "The Duke requires precise nutrition. Each meal must include. I've fed nobility for 20 years, girl." Mrs. Blackwood took a threatening step forward. "I know what a gentleman requires. Rich broths, proper roasts, food with substance." "Food that's killing him," Lynette said quietly. The kitchen fell silent. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed to slits. "You dare suggest?" "I suggest nothing. I am ordering." Lynette drew herself to her full, unimpressive height. "Dr. Fletcher's regimen begins today. You will follow these measurements exactly, or you will seek employment elsewhere." For 3 days it was war. Meals arrived over-salted, under-salted, with forbidden ingredients smuggled in. A prescribed mineral broth appeared cold. Portions vanished mysteriously between kitchen and dining room. Mrs. Blackwood maintained her innocence with theatrical outrage, while the household staff watched to see who would break first, the seasoned cook or the slip of a duchess barely out of the schoolroom. Lynette stationed herself in the kitchens, personally measuring ingredients, observing preparations, rejecting dishes that didn't meet Fletcher's specifications. She endured Mrs. Blackwood's huffing protests, the maid's resentful glances, the steward's disapproving silence. But on the 4th morning, Barnaby descended the stairs without pausing to rest halfway. On the 6th day, he walked to the stables and back without his cane. By the 2nd week, the swelling in his hands had visibly decreased. His color improved. His breathing came easier. The transformation wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was undeniable. Mrs. Blackwood found Lynette reviewing menus in the morning room, her resistance finally crumbling. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, Perhaps I was hasty. If the Duke is truly improving, he is." Lynette met her eyes steadily. "And I need your expertise, Mrs. Blackwood, not your sabotage. Can you give me that?" Something shifted in the older woman's expression, professional pride warring with grudging respect. I can do that." After that, the kitchen became Lynette's ally rather than enemy. Mrs. Blackwood's considerable skills bent toward Fletcher's requirements, transforming medicinal meals into palatable dishes. The household staff whispered about the young duchess who'd tamed their formidable cook. 3 weeks into treatment, Barnaby walked the full length of the portrait gallery without stopping, then stood before his wife with tears in his eyes. "I can't remember the last time I moved without pain," he whispered. "Lynette, I think this might actually work." She embraced him, joy flooding through her chest. Hope, real hope, flickered like a candle flame finally catching. Then the butler appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "Your Grace, Lady Dorothea Grimshaw has arrived. She insists on seeing you both immediately." Lynette's blood ran cold. Through the windows, she glimpsed her former guardian descending from an elegant carriage, her smile venomous even at this distance. Just as hope flickers, Lady Dorothea arrives with venomous smiles, and a dangerous plan. Lady Dorothea swept into the drawing-room like a carrion bird sensing weakness, her black silk rustling with each calculated step. She kissed the air beside Lynette's cheeks with theatrical affection before turning her appraising gaze on Barnaby. "My dear Duke, you look different." Her eyes narrowed with predatory sharpness. "Almost healthy. Dr. Fletcher's treatment shows promise," Barnaby replied carefully, remaining seated, a strategic choice Lynette recognized. Standing would reveal just how much strength he'd regained. How fortunate. Dorothea's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I confess I came with concerns. Lynette is so terribly young, thrust into managing a grand estate. I worry she's being overwhelmed, perhaps influenced by charlatans promising miracle cures." "I manage quite well, thank you," Lynette said coolly. "Of course you believe so, darling." Dorothea's tone dripped condescension. "But grief and duty can cloud judgment. I consulted with several London physicians, the finest minds, and they assure me that His Grace's condition is terminal. These temporary improvements are merely—" "You've done what—" Barnaby's voice carried warning. "Only sought professional opinions. For dear Lynette's sake." Dorothea produced a folded document from her reticule with triumphant flourish. "In fact, I've taken the liberty of filing a petition with Chancery Court. Given His Grace's incapacity and inevitable decline, I believe Lynette requires a proper guardian to protect her interests, someone with experience managing estates and securing her financial future." The words hung in the air like poison. Lynette snatched the document, her hands trembling as she read. Dorothea had assembled affidavits from 3 physicians, none of whom had examined Barnaby in months, declaring him mentally incompetent due to his condition. She sought appointment as trustee over the Hathersage estates, claiming Lynette was too young and vulnerable to protect herself from her husband's inevitable financial collapse. "You're trying to steal everything." Lynette's voice shook with fury. "I'm protecting you from making your father's mistakes." Dorothea snapped, her mask of concern cracking. "You think this Duke married you from honor? He needed your father's debts cleared. And when he dies, which he will, you'll be left with nothing unless someone with sense controls the purse strings. Get out." Barnaby rose slowly, and even diminished by illness. His presence filled the room. "Out of my house. Now." Dorothea's smile returned, cold and victorious. "The petition is filed, Your Grace. The hearing is set for 3 weeks hence. I'll see you in court, if you survive that long." She turned to Lynette, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are always ungrateful, child. I should have let those other gentlemen have you." After she swept out, Lynette collapsed into a chair, the court papers crumpling in her grip. 3 weeks. Barnaby, what if we fight? He knelt before her with effort, taking her hands in his. "Fletcher's treatment works, Lynette. I feel it. Every day I'm stronger. But strong enough? In 3 weeks." Fear clawed at her throat. "She has physicians who will testify you're incompetent. We have only Fletcher, and London will dismiss him as a Scottish eccentric." Barnaby's jaw set with familiar determination. "Then we have 3 weeks to make my recovery undeniable. With court papers served. Time is running out. Can 3 weeks of treatment give Barnaby the strength to fight back?" Dawn broke over Hathersage Manor with crystalline clarity, and Lynette woke to find Barnaby's side of the bed already empty. Alarm shot through her, until she heard his voice drifting through the open window, giving instructions to the head gardener in strong, steady tones. She rushed to the window and froze. Barnaby stood in the garden below, no cane in sight, gesturing toward the rose arbor with both hands free. Sunlight caught the planes of his face, and she realized with a start that the perpetual flush of exhaustion had faded. He looked like a different man, or perhaps the man he'd been before war and illness had stolen his vitality. By the end of the first week, he descended the grand staircase without pausing to grip the banister. By the 10th day, he walked the estate's perimeter with Lynette, their morning constitutional stretching from minutes to an entire hour. His breathing remained even. His stride grew confident. "Look at this," he marveled one afternoon, holding up his wedding ring. "It slides on and off freely. For years, my fingers were so swollen I couldn't remove it." Lynette documented everything with meticulous care. She kept her own ledger now, recording daily improvements alongside measurements and observations. Dr. Fletcher had sent detailed instructions for presenting medical evidence in court, weight charts, symptom timelines, comparative documentation of treatments attempted versus results achieved. She worked late into each night, organizing testimonies from household staff who witnessed the transformation. Mrs. Blackwood provided a detailed account of dietary changes and their correlation with improvement. The head groom testified that His Grace now visited the stables daily, something previously impossible. Even the estate physician, who'd initially dismissed Fletcher's methods, grudgingly admitted the results were highly irregular but undeniable. Barnaby found her one midnight, surrounded by papers in his study. "You should be sleeping." "So should you." She glanced up, then caught her breath. He'd removed his coat and cravat, and through his open shirt collar, she could see that even the swelling in his neck had diminished. "Barnaby, you look human." He smiled wryly. "I feel it. This morning I rode to the village and back. Lynette, I haven't sat a horse in 3 years." His voice cracked slightly. "I've forgotten what it felt like to move through the world without every step being a negotiation with pain." She stood and crossed him, taking his hands. They were warm, strong, the joints no longer grotesquely swollen. "We're going to win this. Dorothea's physicians haven't examined you in months. They're testifying about a man who no longer exists. Thanks to you." He lifted her hand to his lips. "My fierce little duchess who declared war on my kitchen and refused to let me surrender." The night before the hearing, Lynette assembled the final documents with trembling hands. Medical records, testimonies, Dr. Fletcher's detailed explanation of adrenal insufficiency and treatment protocols, photographic evidence showing Barnaby's transformation, before images from months ago beside recent portraits that revealed a man restored. The day of reckoning arrives at dawn, cold and clear. Lynette dressed in her finest dove-gray silk, armor for the battle ahead. Barnaby descended the stairs in formal court dress, moving with the easy confidence of health regained. Their eyes met across the entrance hall. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." "Will Dorothea's lies hold in the face of a duke restored?" The chancery courtroom smelled of beeswax and old leather, its oak-paneled walls bearing witness to decades of contested fortunes. Lady Dorothea sat beside her solicitor with the serene confidence of someone certain of victory, her black bombazine perfectly pressed. 3 London physicians arranged behind her like a wall of medical authority. Lynette gripped Barnaby's hand beneath the table as the magistrate, Lord Justice Pemberton, reviewed the petition with furrowed brow. Dorothea's solicitor rose first, his voice oily with false concern. "My lord, we present a tragic case of a young woman trapped in marriage to a man whose failing health renders him incompetent to manage his affairs. Lady Dorothea seeks only to protect her vulnerable niece from financial ruin." The 3 physicians testified in succession, each painting Barnaby as a man in terminal decline. They cited his massive weight, his dependence on a cane, his inability to walk without exhaustion, symptoms they'd documented months earlier and assumed immutable. The Duke's condition stems from chronic overconsumption and complete lack of physical discipline. Dr. Whitmore declared pompously, "Such deterioration is irreversible. Within months, he will be completely bedridden." Dorothea dabberized theatrically. "I only wish to spare dear Lynette the burden of nursing an invalid while managing estates she cannot possibly understand." Then Barnaby's solicitor stood. "My lord, we request the court hear testimony from Dr. Malcolm Fletcher of Edinburgh, who has been treating his grace under the Duchess's supervision." Dr. Fletcher entered, a lean Scotsman with penetrating eyes and no patience for ceremony. He laid Barnaby's ledgers before the magistrate with deliberate precision. "These documents span 12 years," Fletcher began, his burr thick but clear. "They reveal a patient who meticulously tracked every symptom, every treatment, every failure. Because 17 physicians dismissed his suffering as moral weakness." His voice hardened. "The Duke suffers from adrenal insufficiency secondary to battlefield trauma. Not gluttony, not weakness. A physiological condition, those gentlemen," he gestured toward Dorothea's physicians with barely concealed contempt, "were too arrogant to diagnose." He presented weight charts showing Barnaby's decline despite minimal food intake, symptom timelines correlating with the original injury, comparative documentation of glandular therapy results. The medical evidence was irrefutable, damning in its clarity. And the current state of the patient? Lord Pemberton asked. Perhaps his grace should demonstrate. The courtroom fell silent as Barnaby rose. He walked the full length of the chamber without cane, without hesitation, his stride confident and strong. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Dorothea's face drained of color. "My lord," Barnaby's voice rang with commanding clarity, "I am not dying. I am not incompetent. I am a man who suffered from a misdiagnosed condition until my wife," his eyes found Lynette's, "refused to accept the medical establishment's lazy conclusions. She saved my life through determination and courage." He returned to the table, standing behind Lynette's chair with his hands resting protectively on her shoulders. "Lady Dorothea seeks control of my estates not from concern, but from greed. She views my wife as property to be exploited. I will not allow it." Lord Pemberton's gavel struck like thunder. Petition denied. "Lady Dorothea, your case lacks merit and appears motivated by personal financial interest rather than genuine concern. This court finds the Duke of Hathersage fully competent. Furthermore, any future attempt to interfere with the Duchess's autonomy will be viewed with extreme prejudice." Dorothea's solicitor attempted protest, but Pemberton silenced him with a look. "We are adjourned." Dorothea rose on trembling legs, her mask of concern shattered into naked fury. She locked eyes with Lynette across the chamber, venom in every line of her face, before turning and fleeing through the side exit. Defeated in court, Dorothea slinks away, but society's final judgment awaits at the Christmas ball. The Ashford Christmas ball blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, until the ballroom seemed suspended in liquid gold. Society had gathered in full force. The same voices that had whispered pity and mockery at a wedding 4 months prior now craned their necks as the major domo's voice rang out. His Grace the Duke of Hathersage and Her Grace the Duchess. The conversation didn't merely pause. It died completely. Barnaby descended the grand staircase with Lynette on his arm, moving with the easy confidence of a man who reclaimed his body from years of betrayal. He wore midnight blue velvet that emphasized his broad shoulders, no cane in sight, his posture straight and commanding. Beside him, Lynette shimmered in silver silk, her chin high, her hand resting possessively on her husband's arm. They were magnificent. "Good God," someone breathed. "That cannot be the same man." "The Duke looks healthy. More than healthy. He looks like he could dance all night." Lady Winterbourne's fan snapped shut with audible shock. Lady Ashford, their hostess, recovered first and swept forward with genuine delight. "Your Graces, what a transformation! You must tell us everything about this miraculous recovery." The word spread like wildfire through the ballroom. Miraculous. Guests who pronounced Barnaby's death sentence months ago now clamored to congratulate him, to praise Lynette's devotion, to suddenly recall they'd always believed in unconventional medical approaches. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, Barnaby turned to his wife with a smile that transformed his whole face. "May I have this dance, Duchess?" Lynette's breath caught. "You're certain? It's been so long." "I'm certain." He led her onto the floor as the crowd parted like the Red Sea. His hand settled at her waist, warm and steady. Her palm found his shoulder, and then they were moving, gliding across polished marble in perfect synchronization. Barnaby led with confidence, his steps sure, his breathing even. No trembling, no exhaustion, no pain shadowing his features. Lynette looked up at him and saw wonder reflected in his eyes. "I've forgotten this feeling," he murmured, moving without calculating each step, without rationing energy like a miser. "You're beautiful," she whispered without thinking, then flushed crimson. "So are you." His grip tightened slightly. "Beautiful and fierce and impossibly brave. You fought for me when I'd given up fighting for myself." Other couples joined the dance, but Lynette barely noticed. The ballroom could have been empty for all she cared. The whispers of awe and speculation nothing but distant music. "I didn't do it for gratitude," she said quietly. "I know." His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her heart stumble. "You did it because you're incapable of watching injustice without acting. Because you saw a man drowning and refused to let him sink." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And perhaps because somewhere in these months, duty became something more." "Perhaps," Lynette agreed, her throat tight with emotion. "For both of us." The waltz ended a thunderous applause. As they stood in the center of the ballroom, bathed in candlelight and surrounded by London's finest, Barnaby lifted her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and intimate. Above them, someone had hung mistletoe from the chandelier, a Christmas tradition Lynette barely registered until Barnaby's eyes crinkled with mischief. "It would be terribly unlucky to ignore mistletoe, Duchess." "Terribly," she agreed, rising on her toes as he bent to kiss her. It was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. This was a promise and a declaration, witnessed by the entire ton, sealing their transformation from forced arrangement to genuine partnership. When they parted, the ballroom erupted in cheers. "My sweet family, if you just watched fragile little Lynette become the unbreakable force who saved her Duke and you still haven't subscribed, think how you'll feel when YouTube never shows you the next story of a woman refusing to stay small. Hit subscribe now. You felt every emotion with us tonight. And if you truly won't, please come comment and explain why you want to miss what comes next." Beneath chandeliers and mistletoe, the Duke and Duchess of Haddisage proved that sometimes the greatest love begins with a promise and ends with a miracle.